Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. They said the franchise had been there since the 80s, but some nights it felt older, like the ground beneath it predated memory itself. I always clocked in after midnight, when the real world went quiet and something else began to stir. The Burger King where I worked stood on the edge of a forgotten highway just outside a dying town. During the day it looked like any other fast food joint. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, fluorescent lights humming in a drone of apathy, fryer oil hanging heavy in the air like stale perfume. But at night it changed. Or perhaps I did. Perhaps the hours made of shadows and hums exposed what was always there. I took the job for the solitude, not the money. There was something meditative about the late shift, a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. No customers after 1 a.m., no co-workers most nights. Just me, the machines, and the endless whisper of wind sliding beneath the drive-through window. It was a quiet that could crack your mind if you weren't ready. The first time it happened, I was standing near the walk-in freezer. The temperature back there was always biting, even more than it should have been, like something beneath the floorboards exhaled pure winter. I remember trailing my fingers along the tiled wall. They came away damp, not with condensation, but with something sticky, almost viscous. No source, no smell, just wet. The kind of wet that reminded me of rotting leaves or forgotten basements. I wiped my hand on my apron and told myself it was nothing, but then the lights flickered. Not the usual fluorescent stutter, but a rhythmic pulse like breathing. Light, dark, light, dark. Each flicker timed with a deep, low groan that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there listening, trying to make sense of a sound that felt less like noise and more like memory. Something older than language pressing against the bones of the building. The freezer door creaked, though I hadn't touched it. It swung open a hair, just enough to reveal blackness inside. Not darkness, blackness, thick, textured, velvety. The light from the hallway didn't penetrate it. I closed the door slowly and walked back to the front of the store, my shoes sticking faintly to the linoleum, as if the floor were coated with syrup. The cameras, cheap black domes mounted in corners, seemed to follow me that night. I know how that sounds, but I swear their red recording lights blinked in unison when I passed beneath them. I glanced up once, just once, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something reflected inside the plastic dome. Not me, not the store, something else, something cavernous, impossible, a ceiling too high, a shape too still. I didn't look again. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became patterns. Subtle at first. Paper cups stacked in geometric shapes when I returned from a bathroom break. The fryer oil bubbling even when turned off. Ketchup packets split open and arranged like runes I didn't recognize. I stopped trying to rationalize it. Sleep became harder. My dreams, if they were dreams, began to echo with a strange architecture. I wandered endless corridors made of tiled walls and sticky floors, doors with no handles, fryers hissing like serpents, and a crown, always the crown. The old Burger King crown made of cardboard, soaked through, torn at the edges, resting on a counter drenched in black grease. Sometimes I awoke standing in my apartment's kitchen, still in uniform, hands trembling, nails black with filth I couldn't explain. One night, the drive-through headset crackled to life. I hadn't touched it. I was wiping down the milkshake machine when the static flared in my ear. The headset was off. I hadn't worn it in hours, but the voice came through anyway. A slow, gravelly whisper. Not a language I recognized. More like syllables spoken underwater. Fluid and thick. I couldn't understand a word, but I felt it. Felt it in my gut. The way you feel an earthquake before you hear it. The tremor of meaning just beyond the veil of understanding, and then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the voice. like something had spoken your name and then gone very still. I left early that night, though I told no one. I considered quitting. I even drafted a resignation email. But something, pride, maybe, or obsession, kept me tethered to that place. I needed to know what it was, needed to see it through. Whatever it was. It escalated on the solstice. The manager had left me a note to clean the grease trap, said it was overdue. I'd never touched the thing before, beneath a metal hatch in the floor of the back room. It required a special key, one he'd left in the drawer. I opened the hatch, expecting sludge and stink. Instead, I found stairs. Rusted iron stairs descending into blackness. The smell was there. Oh yes, it was. But more than that, there was a pressure. A weight pressing against my chest like the air had turned to water. The rational part of me screamed to close the hatch to pretend I hadn't seen it. But something older inside me, the part that remembered forgotten places and dreamt in symbols, compelled me downward. Each step groaned underfoot, not with strain, but with greeting. The stairs ended in a corridor, tiled like the store above, but older, much older. The pattern was the same, white, red, yellow, but faded, water-warped, and broken. A hallway of rot and memory. The air was colder than the freezer. At the end of the corridor stood a door, not a freezer door, not a fire exit, a wooden door, ornately carved, with no handle. At its center, the Burger King logo, but older, cruder, as if drawn by hand. And the crown was different, twisted with points like thorns, almost bone. The door opened inward as I approached. The room beyond defied logic. It was enormous, cathedral-like, but the dimensions made no sense. Angles warped, corners bled into curves, the ceiling too far yet too low. The walls shimmered not with light but with presence. And in the center of the room stood a figure, tall, robed, its back to me. It wore the crown, not cardboard, not plastic, bone, real, yellowed and cracked, fused to its skull. I could hear it breathing, not lungs, but something deeper, a rhythmic pulling of air through absence. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure turned. Its face was wrong, smoothed, stretched as if erased. No eyes, no mouth. But I felt its attention like heat on skin. And in its hands, it held a tray. On it, a burger. The bun was bleeding. The lettuce twitched. The patty was raw and something inside it pulsed. The crown atop it wasn't decorative. It was made of nails. I ran. I don't remember climbing the stairs. Don't remember driving home. But I woke up in my bathtub, clothes soaked, mouth full of ash. I called out sick for 3 days. No one answered. Not my manager. Not corporate. I drove by the restaurant one night needing to see it, needing to prove it was still just a building. But it wasn't there. The lot was empty. No sign. No lights. Just asphalt cracked and weeping black moss. I got out of my car, walked to where the entrance had been, bent down. The tiles were still there, faded, faint, buried beneath layers of dust and growth, but they were there. And as I stood there, heart pounding, the ground hummed, faintly, like a deep fryer coming to life like breath. Something is still down there. I see it in dreams now. See the crowned figure in reflections in windows, in my own shadow at dusk. I haven't eaten since. Everything tastes of grease and ash and blood. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I feel the headset crackle. I feel it whisper. A language older than hunger, older than kings, older than me. Somewhere in the bones of that house, something was still breathing. I could feel it every night, low, rhythmic, and deep, like a massive sleeper turning beneath the floorboards. The move had been sudden. My job, an isolating one by nature, offered a transfer to a quieter region, far from the city's chaos. I was promised peace, but what I found on Winter Hollow Lane felt like the absence of something far older than noise. The house stood alone, framed by weeping trees and crooked fences, a forgotten relic tucked at the edge of a rotting woodland where the road collapsed into gravel and shadow. No neighbors, no traffic, just a single winding lane that ended where the forest swallowed it whole. It was autumn and the sky hung low, always gray, always wet. The house, purchased at a price suspiciously low, seemed at first merely old. The boards were dry and splintered, the windows thin and brittle. Cold draft crept through the hallways like searching hands, but it was livable, or so I convinced myself. It had a strange symmetry. Too many rooms for a single man, too many doors that led nowhere useful. Some opened onto bare walls. One, I swear, opened onto a flight of stairs that descended further than should have been architecturally possible, only to be gone when I returned with a flashlight. I attributed these things to fatigue, stress, or faulty memory. We do that, don't we? When the world shivers in front of our eyes, we blame ourselves. We anchor back to the real, until the anchor snaps. I remember the smell first. Not of rot, exactly, but of something earthbound and wet, like disturbed soil under fingernails. It clung to certain corners of the house, particularly beneath the staircase and inside the closet of the room I'd chosen as my study. I aired them out, scrubbed them with bleach, placed bowls of vinegar on the shelves. Nothing changed. That smell always returned, and with it came the sound. It was never loud. Faint scratching, sometimes a sigh, a low hum that echoed through the vents even when the furnace was off. On rainy nights I could swear I heard something pacing the upper floor, slow and deliberate, while I remained frozen in the living room below. I learned not to look toward the ceiling. Still I slept. Deeply, but never peacefully. My dreams turned feverish. Each night I wandered unfamiliar corridors, black, windowless, and moist. There was always water, sometimes up to my knees, and something brushing past my ankles that I couldn't see. My reflection in those dreams never mirrored me. It stood too still, watching from slick surfaces that shouldn't have reflected anything in that lightless place. By the second week, mirrors in the real house began to distort. Not violently, not overtly, but if I looked long enough, I'd see a delay in movement, or catch glimpses of shadows that didn't belong. The worst was the long mirror in the upstairs hallway. It began to feel inhabited. I covered it with a sheet, but even then, I would catch it whispering to itself, or rather, whispering to something on the other side. I stopped turning the lights off at night. The house had a crawl space, a narrow, damp place accessible only from a hatch in the basement. I didn't go near it for the first month, but during one of the many nights where the noises escalated, deep groans from the walls and slow knocks from inside the floor, I descended with the rusted key the agent had left me. The air thickened with each step, charged with the scent of old copper and something far more biological. My flashlight quivered in my hand as I reached the hatch. I don't remember opening it. I just remember standing before it, heart galloping, the beam catching the edge of something slick and pale below. I never opened it again, but something started crawling out. I began keeping logs, timestamps, recordings, photos. None held. The tapes recorded only silence, punctuated by static that made my teeth ache. The photos came out warped, as though the angles had melted. I sent a few to a colleague. He didn't respond. Later I learned he'd gone on indefinite leave citing cognitive disruptions. I wondered if he had seen what I had missed. It wasn't just the house. It was the land. On fog-heavy mornings, I'd walk to the tree line. The air grew colder there, unnaturally so. Birds avoided the area. Even insects fled the perimeter. I found stone formations in the underbrush, concentric circles, symbols etched with obsessive precision, all half swallowed by the moss. Some were clearly old, centuries maybe, but others looked fresh. too fresh. On one, a piece of cloth was tied like a sacrifice. It hadn't rotted. I never touched it again. I began to see people. Not clearly, not in daylight. At the edge of the forest, shapes would stand, just far enough to be mistaken for stumps or shadows. But they were there, watching, always watching. Once, in the dead hours of morning, I saw one move, bending impossibly as though its spine were liquid, then vanish behind a tree far too thin to conceal a body. I stopped leaving the house. That's when the dreams changed. Now they showed me the house from below, as though I were buried beneath it. I could see the beams, the pipes, the roots tangling like veins around a yawning pit that pulsed. It felt alive. The walls bled, not metaphorically. In the dreams, I'd awaken in my bed to find black rivulets running down the walls, as if the house were sweating out its memories. There was chanting then, low, wordless, layered like many throats humming in dissonance. I found a journal in the attic shortly after, water-damaged and mold-flecked but legible. It belonged to a man named Elias Ashcroft, dated 1872. The entries were short, fragmented, often repetitive. He wrote of cleansing the soil, of the crooked house being a vessel, not a home. He mentioned rituals, dream-born rites, and something called the root mother. He never described her, only said, she chooses from below. The last entry read, I hear her crawling through the pipes. The walls are wet with her whisper. If I lie still enough, she passes over me. I left the journal where I found it. Somehow I knew she didn't like it being moved. My mental state began to erode. I couldn't work. I couldn't read. Words slithered off the page, rearranging into foreign phrases that lingered even when I closed the book. My reflection stopped mimicking me entirely. I'd stand motionless, watching it tilt its head, studying me with a hunger that felt old and personal. Time broke. Days bled together like bruises. I'd wake to find food uneaten, water running, lights flickering even when the power was off. I stopped sleeping. I think the house noticed. It began to shift. Doors no longer led where they should. A hallway would be longer on one walk than the next. My bedroom changed orientation entirely. I could no longer tell which direction the windows faced. Some mornings I would awaken in a different room, or on the floor, or once, terrifyingly, in the crawl space. The hatch sealed above me with scratch marks on my arms I didn't remember making. I started keeping all the lights on again. But the house grew darker anyway. The bulbs dimmed over time. Not all at once, just a little each day. I tried replacing them, but the new ones flickered too. It was as if the house were feeding on the light, draining it, swallowing it the way it did sound, time, and thought. I remembered what Elias had written, if I lie still enough. I started sleeping with cotton in my ears, eyes covered, arms at my sides. Still, I felt her pass, cold like wet leaves. She touched nothing and everything at once. One night I felt her breath on my eyelids. I did not move. I think the house wants me to become it. I can't explain that in any rational sense, but I feel it, as one feels the heat of fire without seeing the flame. It wants me not as a resident, but as a replacement. It's hollowing me out, memory by memory. I forget names now. My own face seems unfamiliar. I write this only because something in me fights still, some last little coil of defiance against the dark pressure folding in. But even this act, writing, feels stolen, borrowed, as though I'm scribbling on skin that isn't mine. Last night I saw her. She was in the long mirror I'd covered. The sheet was gone. I don't remember removing it. I stood before it, unable to look away. The reflection behind me was no longer mine. It was of the house, open and cavernous, with walls of flesh and mouths where the windows should be. She was standing in the center, not facing me, but I saw her all the same. Tall. Wrong. Her limbs were too long, her back arched like a question. Her hair moved as if underwater. She did not turn. She didn't have to. I felt her see me. Deep, deep in the marrow of my teeth. I fell. Or maybe I woke. It didn't matter. She followed me into the waking world. Now the house is warm. That's the worst part. It's no longer cold. It breathes with me. It hums when I walk. The smell is gone, replaced by something sweeter, almost pleasant, like honeysuckle mixed with rot. I think it's finished learning me. The mirrors show only stillness now. My dreams are quiet. Too quiet. I haven't left in weeks, maybe months. Outside, the trees lean closer to the house. The road is gone. No wind, no birds, just stillness. The house wants me still, silent, softened. Sometimes I feel something shifting beneath the floor like muscle beneath skin. I wonder if I'll become the next Elias, or if I already have. I wonder if someone new will find this place one day and read these words and think me mad. Maybe they'll move in anyway. Maybe the house will like them better. I can feel her tonight. She's coming up through the walls again. Not cruel, not angry, just hungry. And I think at last, I'm ready to be eaten. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the refusal of sound to enter a place. That's what I first noticed about the room at the end of the hall. It did not receive sound. It rejected it. When I first moved into the house, I was desperate. The city had chewed through my savings, and I couldn't bear the weight of another apartment hunt. So when the listing appeared, private room, quiet house, furnished, 500 month, must be comfortable with existing tenant, I responded immediately. The ad had no photos, only a line of text and a phone number. Something about the vagueness of it struck me, but I didn't care. The voice on the other end of the line told me to come by that evening. The house stood at the edge of an older neighborhood tucked behind a wall of hedges, its roof lost behind the thicket of gnarled trees. It had a neglected look, not dirty exactly, but covered in a patina of time, as if it were retreating from the present. I moved in the next morning. My roommate, if he existed, never showed himself. I saw the evidence of someone, the faint scuff marks of shoes by the back door, the way certain cabinets were already arranged with mismatched china, the occasional creak of footsteps in the early hours, but never a body, never a voice. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs. Mine was near the front, painted in the pale yellow of a hospital corridor. The other was at the far end of the hall, behind a door that remained locked at all times. No light seeped from beneath it. No sound emerged. Not even when I knocked one night, out of both boredom and curiosity. There was no response. Not even the echo of my own touch. It was in that silence that the discomfort began. At first, it was small things. The slow, creeping cold that came at night despite the heater being on. The way the wallpaper in the hallway seemed slightly peeled in the morning, then perfectly flush by evening. How I'd sometimes catch the smell of burnt earth just before I fell asleep. I told myself the house was old. Old houses have histories. They breathe and settle and groan. I convinced myself this was the case here. But the unease grew. There were dreams. Or what I told myself were dreams. They didn't unfold with the erratic logic of sleep, but rather with the vivid clarity of memory. In these visions, I would walk down the hallway in the dark, barefoot, each step heavier than the last, as if the floor itself were resisting me. I'd reach the locked door and it would be open, just a crack, enough for me to see that the space beyond was not a bedroom. It was much older than that, a room of stone, or perhaps soil, its walls pulsing gently as if alive. At the center stood a figure, tall, faceless, wrapped in something that resembled both robes and roots. I could never remember what it did, only that I woke up each time with blood beneath my fingernails and the taste of soil in my mouth. The house began to change, slowly, subtly, with the patience of something ancient. The windows fogged more often, even on warm days. Mirrors held my reflection a moment too long. My phone lost reception in every room except the kitchen, and even then, Calls would be garbled, voices distant and distorted as though traveling across a great chasm. I tried inviting friends over, but every time something interfered. A flat tire, a last-minute cancellation, a sudden illness. I began to suspect the house did not want them here, and they perhaps did not want to come. I began to feel watched, not in the paranoid curtain-peeking sense, but something far deeper, an interior gaze, a feeling that something inside me had been turned outward, that my thoughts were no longer my own. I'd sit in the living room and feel my heartbeat echo through the floorboards as if the house were listening, attuned, hungering. The dreams escalated. They no longer occurred only at night. I'd close my eyes in the shower and find myself standing in that same subterranean room, the air damp and ancient, the figure in the center no longer silent but humming, a low, resonant tone that spoke directly into the marrow of my bones. When I awoke, or reawoke, I'd find bruises in symmetrical shapes down my spine, circles within circles, the kind of pattern you'd find carved into stone on some forgotten continent. Sleep became a gamble. I began taking long walks at night just to avoid the house, but no matter how far I walked, how long I stayed away, I always found myself back before midnight, feet aching, heart racing, as though I were being reeled in on an invisible thread. The room at the end of the hall changed too. The air around it grew colder. The wood beneath my feet warped, as if resisting the weight of the door. Once, in a fit of defiance, I pressed my ear to it. At first, I heard nothing. Then, the faint rhythmic sound of breathing. Not human breathing, something deeper, wetter, like lungs filled with mud. I stumbled away, heart pounding, and that night, I dreamed of drowning beneath black soil while roots threaded through my limbs like veins. There was a library in the town. One day, desperate for understanding, I went there and searched for anything I could find about the house. Old property records, obituaries, folklore. I found almost nothing. The house had changed ownership many times, often through estate sales, never through standard means. There were no photos of its interior, no mention of renovations, and most curiously, no names of previous tenants listed in the public records, as though each had been carefully removed. But I found something else. A local historian, a woman in her 70s who spoke of the soil cults that once thrived in this region, long before the city rose around them. She spoke of rituals tied to fertility and decay, of houses built over sites of convergence, places where the earth was thinner and things could pass through. She mentioned the listening dark and the watchers beneath. When I asked her what they watched for, she only said, "They don't watch for something, they watch someone. One of them always comes back." I returned home with the taste of rust in my mouth. By this point, time had started to lose its shape. I could no longer tell how long I'd been in the house. Days blurred. Sometimes the sun would rise only to set an hour later. Other times, the night stretched endlessly, the sky a deep, oily gray. I stopped using my phone. It rang once, a single tone, high-pitched and thin, and when I answered, there was only silence. No, not silence. Breathing, like before. Only this time it was closer. The door at the end of the hall no longer locked. I didn't open it, I wouldn't, but I noticed the latch no longer held. Sometimes I'd pass and see it hanging slightly ajar, revealing only shadow, and what looked like, briefly, a length of braided hair curling out across the floor before retreating like a worm into soil. My reflection changed. Not noticeably at first. Just small things. The whites of my eyes yellowing. My hair growing faster, thicker, falling out in clumps. My skin took on a grayish tone, like old paper. But it wasn't until I looked into the mirror one morning and saw my mouth not moving, despite the fact that I was humming to myself, that I understood I was no longer alone in myself. Something was living alongside me, or perhaps through me. I tried to leave once, packed a bag, made it as far as the street. But as I turned the corner, the world bent. The sky cracked briefly, not visibly, but conceptually, as if I'd reached the edge of a page in a book and tried to step off it. I woke up in my bed. The packed bag was gone. That night I dreamed of the room again, only this time I was inside it. The walls were not stone, they were flesh, veined, warm, beating. The figure approached. I could not look away. It pressed something into my hands, a seed, black, pulsing. When I awoke, my hands were dirty. Beneath my fingernails, tiny filaments twitched. I am no longer sure I live alone, or that I ever did. The house feels different now. Not haunted, but occupied. It watches me not with malice, but expectation. I feel myself becoming part of it. The floor groans in response to my movements. My breath causes the walls to tremble subtly. I can no longer hear birds or wind outside. Only the steady hum of the house, a heartbeat, a rhythm, as if I were inside something slumbering. There is one more thing I haven't admitted. 2 nights ago, I entered the room. I don't remember opening the door. I only remember being inside. It was not as I imagined, not a void, or a tomb, or some ceremonial chamber. It was a replica of my own room. Down to the furniture, the linens, the stack of unread books on the nightstand. But everything was reversed, mirrored. I stepped inside and saw myself lying in the bed, eyes closed, breathing gently. I watched for a long time. Then the figure entered from the far wall, tall, faceless. It did not acknowledge me. It stood beside the other me and gently placed a hand upon my chest. The other me exhaled sharply and stopped breathing. When I turned to run, I found the door had vanished. Now I do not know if I ever left, if the one writing this is me, or the thing that watched me die. Sometimes I feel the hum returning. I taste earth when I speak. I see things move in mirrors that do not exist in the room behind me. My memories are softening, as if submerged in water too long. Some days I forget my name, but the house remembers. It never forgets. The room at the end of the hall is open now. It calls softly, insistently, in a tone I can no longer distinguish from my own thoughts. I know what comes next. I've seen it. I've dreamed it. I will leave the door open for the next one. I will wait in silence, and the house will hum. There was a moment, just before I saw it, whatever it was, when the air went entirely still, and the trees leaned ever so slightly inward, as if the world were holding its breath. I should have turned back then, but something deeper than curiosity pulled me forward. Something older and nameless, like a voice without language speaking directly to the bones. It began in late September, that season of paper-thin light and soft decay, when the days smell faintly of rot and memory. I had returned to my hometown after years away, one of those forgotten Midwestern towns, tucked between dormant hills and overgrown farmland, where time moves sideways and everything feels just a little behind the rest of the world. My parents were long gone, and my return was not sentimental. I came back only because there was nowhere else left to go. The house they left behind was brittle with silence, the kind that accumulates in unused corners like dust. I spent my days tending to their estate, sorting yellowed letters, untangling the logic of old bills, wandering the familiar streets that now felt eerily hollow. But at night I often found myself driving. No destination, just motion. That was how I ended up outside the rusted gates of Hollow Pines Adventure Park. It had closed nearly 20 years ago after a series of accidents. Unexplained injuries, a fire, some child who had gone missing in the tunnels of the Lost Cavern attraction. Nothing was ever conclusively proven. No lawsuits, no charges. Just an abrupt shuttering, a chain across the front gate, and decades of whispered theories among teenagers looking for places to break into and dare each other to stay overnight. I hadn't thought of the park in years. As a child, I remembered it only vaguely. Fragments of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of generators, sticky pavement, and mechanical laughter echoing down empty corridors. But standing at the fence that night, I felt something stir within me. Recognition without recollection, like a song half remembered from a dream. The air was sharp and quiet, the kind of quiet that buzzes in the ears. I told myself I'd only walk the perimeter, just see how far it stretched. A distraction, nothing more. The fence had long since been torn open. Through it lay a narrow wooded trail, overgrown with roots and brambles, leading deeper into the park's decayed core. I stepped through, and something shifted. I do not mean this figuratively. There was a physical sensation as if the air thickened like walking through a curtain of oil. I felt the skin on my arms pimple. I hesitated, but the pull was undeniable, like gravity toward something buried. The path curved through dead trees and husks of broken booths, old popcorn stands covered in moss, game stalls filled with moldering plush animals whose eyes had caved in long ago. Overhead, string lights still dangled from poles, their glass bulbs blackened but intact, swaying gently despite the air's stillness. The soundscape changed as I walked further in. My footsteps grew louder, too loud, each crunch of leaf and gravel amplified like thunder, and then quieter again. The acoustics didn't follow logic. It was as if sound traveled in loops, folding in on itself. I passed the bumper car arena, now flooded with stagnant rainwater. The once vibrant colors had faded to a dull gray-blue like bruised flesh. Beyond that, the Ferris wheel stood frozen in mid-spin, its cars tilted like limp pedals. Rust streaked its spokes, and yet there was no visible corrosion at the base, as though it had been untouched by time but not by memory. But it was the lost cavern that drew me. I didn't remember the details of the attraction, only that it had once terrified me, not in the way haunted houses scare children, but something deeper. There had been a smell, a coldness, something about the way the corridors twisted unnaturally, how you couldn't hear your own voice inside. I should have turned back, but by then I felt strangely disconnected from myself, like a dreamer who has forgotten they are asleep. The entrance was carved to resemble a rock face with the word cavern etched above in jagged letters. A wooden sign still hung askew. Please keep hands inside at all times. Below that, in smaller print, another message, barely legible under mildew: do not look at the walls too long. I stepped inside. Immediately, the temperature dropped. The air turned damp, metallic, thick with the scent of wet stone and rusted iron. I followed the main path downward into the artificial cavern, though it didn't feel artificial anymore. The walls were rough, almost organic, and pulsed faintly beneath my fingertips. I told myself it was a trick of condensation, but the further I descended, the more the architecture changed. The walls widened, then narrowed unpredictably. Some sections were jagged and raw, while others felt smoothed by centuries of touch like worn altars. The air grew heavier with every step, pressing against my skin, not with weight, but with presence. There were no lights, yet I could see faintly. A low greenish glow emanated from somewhere indiscernible, not from any fixture or bulb, just a pervading radiance, as though the darkness itself was emitting light. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, not cast by my figure, but independent, flickering along the walls like silhouettes of things that weren't there. I passed rooms filled with long-forgotten props. Rubber bats hung stiff from wires, their wings cracked. An animatronic miner frozen mid-scream. Mannequins melted and fused into the walls. Their faces smoothed out, eyeless, nameless. But it was the murals that unsettled me most. They covered the walls in spiraling patterns, cave paintings but not of animals or humans. Abstract forms, concentric eyes, elongated limbs, symbols that seemed to shimmer if you stared too long. There was an undeniable intelligence behind them, though not a human one. I remembered the sign's warning and looked away, but I felt it then. Something beneath the mural, something watching through the wall, not from behind it. I couldn't say how long I wandered. Time unraveled in that place. My watch had stopped ticking, its hands frozen at 3:17. Whether AM or PM no longer mattered. The air grew thinner, and the corridors became less constructed, more natural. Cracked rock, dripping stalactites, floors slick with algae. And then the sound began. At first it was barely perceptible, like a deep humming beneath the frequency of hearing, something I felt rather than heard. It vibrated in my molars, tugged at my sternum. A low chant, rhythmic, cyclical, utterly inhuman. Not vocal, not mechanical. Something older, organic. I turned a corner and entered a massive cavern. There was no roof, only blackness stretching infinitely above. In the center of the chamber, a pit. A perfect circle carved into the floor, its edges too precise to be natural. I approached against every instinct. The hum intensified. When I stood at the edge, I saw nothing but void within. No bottom, no sides, just darkness. But the longer I stared, the more I became convinced something was rising inside it. Slowly, patiently, shapes began to form, indistinct, shifting, glimpsed only peripherally, like looking into a mirror filled with smoke. Limbs, but not quite. Eyes, but layered wrong. Its form was not of one thing, but many, as though it were composed of the memories of creatures rather than flesh itself. And then I saw my own face reflected in the void, but distorted, smiling, moving independently of me, its eyes too wide, its mouth open just a fraction too long. I turned to run, but the corridor behind me was gone. In its place, a wall of wet, breathing stone. No exit. Only more of those shifting murals now moving openly. The figures twisted and multiplied, forming patterns I could almost understand. Not language, not art. A form of cognition I was never meant to grasp. The chanting grew louder. I pressed myself against the wall, hoping it would give way, but it only pulsed in response. Warm, almost affectionate. And then I realized it was inside me now. The rhythm, the logic. My thoughts had slowed, become rhythmic. I tried to count numbers in my head but could no longer remember how. Began to hear my name, not aloud but threaded into the vibrations. Not spoken, understood. They were telling me things, memories not my own, visions of cyclopean cities buried under ash, of creatures worshipped by tribes long gone, of rituals performed in secret chambers beneath sacred sites that have since become shopping malls and playgrounds. This place had been built atop one of those ancient vaults. The amusement park was a mask, a capstone placed over a buried throat. But the mask had begun to crack. I closed my eyes, but even in that darkness I saw the pit open wide, not downward but inward, a fold in space, a knot of reality where something had been waiting, watching, choosing. It had not been the missing child who disturbed this place, nor the fire. It was the park's final patron, me. Some part of me is still down there. I don't remember how I escaped. Only that I woke up on the side of the road, clothes soaked, shoes missing, my palms raw and bleeding as though I had clawed my way out of something. I walked back to town in a trance. My body moved. My mind drifted. A buzzing filled my ears for days afterward, and I could not bear to look at mirrors for weeks. I never told anyone. Not because I feared disbelief, but because part of me wants to go back. At night, I still hear the chant beneath my pillow. Soft, persistent, coaxing. I wake with dirt under my nails and gravel in my mouth. My teeth ache. Sometimes I find old ticket stubs in my pockets, damp and crumbling, stamped with dates that don't exist. I've started drawing again. Patterns, circles, eyes within eyes. My hands move without instruction, sketching symbols I've never learned but somehow understand. I burn them, but they reappear on my walls, my ceiling, my eyelids when I blink too long. The park has vanished now. I returned once during daylight but found nothing. The fence was gone, the trail overrun with trees so old they shouldn't have grown so fast. Locals claim it never existed. Old records are missing. Even satellite images show only forest where it once stood, but I remember. I remember the hollow in the earth, the light that did not shine, the presence that did not move yet devoured every sound. I know now that it was not a place built for amusement. It was a mouth, and it opened just wide enough to taste me. Soon, it will hunger again. And when it calls, I will answer. Because I never truly left. Not all of me. Some part remains, forever circling the pit beneath the park, humming its song in the dark, waiting for you. The first time I saw the cabin in Oak Woods, it felt less like discovering a place and more like remembering one I had forgotten. Not from my life, but from some deeper, older origin. I'd gone there alone, seeking stillness after my father died. A death like his, not sudden but slow and crumbling, had a way of stretching itself out beyond the funeral, lingering like a bruise under the skin. The cabin, recommended by a colleague who barely knew me, sat nestled in the folds of the northern woods, far past the last winding road and deeper than any GPS dared follow. There was no marked path. The trees grew dense and crooked, hunched like silent figures watching from a distance. The locals called them auk trees, a name with no origin I could find and not quite like oak or ash. Their trunks twisted like strands of muscle, bark peeling in blackened curls, their leaves sharp-edged and whisper-thin, rustling even when there was no wind. I arrived near dusk just as the sky paled to a silvery blue, and even then the shadows among those trees seemed too dark for twilight. The cabin appeared abruptly without warning, as if it had been placed there in secret. It was older than I'd expected, far older. Its wood was nearly black, stained not by paint but by time, and its windows were narrow slits, like watchful eyes in the gloom. A porch sagged forward under its own weight, as though the building had spent too long listening to things it could not unhear. There was no lock on the door. It creaked open under my hand without resistance, revealing a single low-ceilinged room. Everything inside was sparse: a fireplace choked with ash, a cot with thin woolen sheets, a cast-iron stove that exhaled a faint smell of rust. On the wall, a single object hung: a mirror framed in a dull greenish metal, its glass so warped it barely reflected at all. There was no electricity, no plumbing. That first night I lit a fire and listened to the woods. It was not the silence I had hoped for. Rather, it was a kind of layered quiet, a hush beneath which something else breathed. I could hear it, the soft groan of branches shifting without wind, a clicking sound like teeth behind bark, the slow shuffle of movement just past the reach of the firelight. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was grief playing tricks, a mind unsettled by recent death. I read by candlelight, stared into the mirror long enough to blur my features, and eventually fell asleep to the irregular ticking of something in the walls. On the second night, I began to dream. It was not like normal dreaming. There was no narrative, no images, only sensations. A heavy weight pressed down on my chest, and the air turned syrup thick, sweet, and rancid like fermented fruit. My limbs moved sluggishly, as though submerged. I felt watched, not by one presence, but by many. Indistinct and cold, like fingers pressed gently to the base of the skull. When I woke, there were prints on the window glass. Not handprints, longer, with too many joints, as though something had leaned in to peer through the narrow slit while I slept. The prints vanished by morning, evaporating like dew. I did not leave. I told myself I had imagined them, but something had shifted. The woods no longer felt passive. The paths I had followed to gather water or firewood now curled strangely, leading me past the same boulder 3 times in a row, or opening onto clearings I did not remember. On the 4th day, I found a stone circle. 8 slabs, each weathered to the texture of bone, arranged with unnatural symmetry. The air inside the ring was colder, and when I stepped into it, I heard the distant rhythmic sound of something beating, not a drum but slower, wetter. I stepped out. The sound stopped. Inside the cabin, I began to feel watched, not just from outside but from within. The mirror especially began to trouble me. Its surface seemed subtly wrong, too dim in daylight, too bright at night, as though it reflected more than the room. I caught myself glancing at it too often, then avoiding it altogether. Once, while passing it in the dark, I felt a momentary resistance, as if something inside the glass had pressed against my reflection in passing. Each night, the dreams grew heavier. I began to descend stairs that did not exist in the waking world, spiral staircases made of stone slick with moss and blood. I could hear voices, not speaking, but whispering in a language I did not know, yet felt in my bones. The phrases burrowed into my mind, and sometimes I would find myself murmuring them upon waking, the syllables tasting bitter and metallic on my tongue. I found a journal tucked beneath the cot on the 6th day. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with jagged handwriting that grew less legible over time. The final entries were almost childlike, scrawled with a trembling hand. They spoke of the rooted ones and the memory beneath the soil. The author, unnamed, warned not to look into the mirror after midnight, not to cross the stone ring while dreaming, and not to answer if the knock comes from beneath. That night, I stayed awake, watching the mirror from my cot. At exactly 3:17 a.m., it shimmered, not a reflection, but as if something behind the glass had shifted. I could make out a hallway, impossibly long and veined with black roots, extending from the back of the mirror into a darkness deeper than night. Something stood far down its length, not moving, not breathing, watching. It vanished when I blinked. The mirror returned to its warped, opaque stillness. By now, the days were growing indistinct. Time passed strangely in Elk Woods. My watch stopped, and the sun no longer rose where it had before. Once, it hung in the sky directly above the cabin, unmoving, for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, it plunged below the horizon in a single breathless moment, leaving the forest in darkness before I could light a candle. I started noticing changes to my own body. My skin grew pale and papery, my nails brittle, my eyes bloodshot no matter how long I slept. There was a taste in my mouth, like old copper. My dreams began to echo into waking hours. I would smell smoke where there was none, or hear chanting under the sound of my footsteps. Sometimes, while sitting on the porch, I'd look down and see not my own hands, but a pair longer, narrower. Fingers jointed in too many places, nails black and curved. The line between me and the woods was thinning. I began to remember things I had never experienced. A fire in a grove of oak trees. Figures dancing around the stone ring, their eyes black as oil, mouths open in soundless song. A child buried beneath the floorboards of the cabin, not in fear, but as offering. And always, the mirror. On the 12th night, I woke to find the fireplace lit. I had not lit it. The fire burned white, flickering without heat. Shadows danced across the walls, though the room was still. I stood, and for the first time walked directly to the mirror. Its surface was clear now, disturbingly so. The hallway was back, closer. The roots pulsed gently like veins. That figure stood just a few steps away now. I could almost make out a face, though it was not mine. Its features were stretched and weathered, as though carved from driftwood, with hollow sockets where eyes should be. And then it moved. Not forward, but in perfect synchrony with me, as though we were bound. A reflection, yes, but no longer mine. Something behind the glass knocked once, then twice. Then, from beneath the floorboards came the third knock. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the fire, eyes fixed to the boards beneath the cot. They seemed to breathe slightly, swelling upward, then settling down, as if the earth beneath was moving in slow rhythm. By dawn, I could see shapes in the mirror, even when the room was bright. The hallway had become a window into a world darker, older. I saw the stone ring again. But this time, it was filled with writhing things, long-limbed and limbless, their forms half root, half flesh, whispering through the bark of oak trees. And I saw myself among them. The realization came not as shock, but as memory. I had been here before. Not in this life, perhaps, but in another, or in something deeper than a life. A thread that wound through the woods and back into the mirror, again and again. Each time forgotten, until it was not. On the 14th night, I buried the journal in the clearing. I burned my clothes and sat in the stone ring until I could no longer feel the cold. The whispering grew louder, now audible even without sleep. The cabin had ceased to be shelter. It was a mouth, open and waiting. The forest no longer watched me from afar. It stood around me like old friends. That evening, I walked into the woods with no intention of returning. I followed a trail I had never seen before, lined with bones wrapped in moss. The trees parted for me. The mirror followed, not physically but in mind. Its shape haunted every dark surface, every puddle, every eye I imagined in the bark. Somewhere along the path, I lost track of myself. When I returned to the cabin, or what looked like the cabin, it had changed. It was older, or newer, or perhaps I was simply no longer the same. The walls pulsed like lungs. The fireplace had become a deep pit. The mirror had taken the whole far wall, stretching floor to ceiling, reflecting not the room but the woods, and things that moved in them. Things that had no face, but wore mine. I now sleep only when the mirror wills it. I no longer dream. Instead, I remember there is no exit from Oak Woods. The roads unravel behind you like torn fabric. Maps curl into ash when drawn. Those who visit are not chosen. They are returned. Each of us called back to the soil that bore us, back to the black veins that run beneath bark and bone. And I can feel it now, beneath the floor, beneath the roots, beneath what we call earth. The thing that watches through the mirror, through our eyes, through time. It is not evil. It is not kind. It is simply waiting. And I, too, am learning to wait. Should you find the cabin, do not enter. But if you already have, then you have always been here, and it is far too late to leave. Even now, when I hear the low hum of distant music or the clinking of glass, I feel a soft shiver crawl behind my ears, as though some part of me remembers what I desperately try to forget. There are gaps in my memory, yes, but the parts that remain are so vivid they feel carved into bone. It was supposed to be a celebration, one last indulgence before I stepped into marriage, a bachelor's party, arranged by my closest friends, orchestrated with the usual promises of alcohol, laughter, and the temporary illusion of youth unbound. Yet what they offered me, unknowingly or not, was something much older, something that did not celebrate but remembered. The cabin was far from anything I would have chosen. It lay in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a timber-framed relic squatting in a clearing like an ancient thing that had never truly been alive. The invitation came with enthusiasm from Marcus, the best man, who'd found it online under some obscure listing with no reviews. Perfect for privacy, he said, and indeed we saw no sign of the world for miles. Even the winding path that led there seemed to resist us, a narrow gravel tongue swallowed by the forest growing more indistinct the deeper we drove. The others arrived ahead of me. I came late, delayed by work or perhaps by an unspoken reluctance I didn't fully acknowledge. The sun was beginning to sink behind the tree line when I parked my car and approached the clearing. The last of the light was thin and golden, like the breath of something dying, and the air smelled of moss, wet wood, and the faint metallic trace of iron. There were 6 cars but no one outside. I assumed they were inside already drinking, but when I knocked and let myself in, I found only silence. The cabin was larger than I had expected, its ceilings high and pitched, its beams so dark they looked scorched. There were antlers mounted above the fireplace, and woven tapestries adorned the walls, dull and earthen, with abstract patterns that made my vision blur if I stared too long. I walked room to room calling names but received no answer. I told myself it was a prank, an orchestrated start to the evening's revelry. They'd jump out, laugh, offer me a beer, and the night would begin. But no one came. Their bags were there, phones on counters still warm from use. The refrigerator was stocked, the firewood piled neatly beside the hearth. On the long dining table were red plastic cups, a deck of cards mid-game, and half-smoked cigars still curling the air with ghostly tendrils. The signs of life were fresh, yet the silence was total. Thick, not passive, but oppressive, as though it had settled in recently and swallowed whatever it found. I should have left then. I should have called someone. But I did neither. I told myself they were in the woods, exploring or setting something up, and I would join them soon enough. But dusk fell with a sharpness that felt deliberate, and when the last of the color drained from the windows, I found myself lighting candles, not out of necessity, but to fend off the unease curling in my chest. As night claimed the cabin, the light from the flames danced strangely against the walls. The tapestries shimmered with movement that felt neither natural nor optical. I tried not to look at them. The house creaked, but it was not the creak of old wood under heat or age. It was the sound of something breathing. I opened the door once to step outside and call for them. My voice carried into the forest, bounced and returned changed, distorted, like it passed through a tunnel of water. The air outside was colder than it had any right to be, and the trees looked wrong. Their branches too still, too skeletal, like the veins of something dead yet watching. I did not sleep that first night. I sat on the couch with a bottle in hand, not drinking, only holding it for warmth, for weight. And sometime between midnight and whatever came after, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, the cadence of someone pacing with thought. I stood, my heart tapping against my ribs like a moth in glass, and stared at the ceiling. I called out again. No answer. I took the stairs one step at a time, each groaning under my weight. At the top, the hallway was darker than the rooms downstairs, though I had not extinguished any lights. The air here was wrong, warmer, damper, as though the house itself was sweating. I turned left toward the last room where the footsteps had ended. The door was slightly open, not enough to see in, only enough to suggest it had not been fully closed. I reached for it. The handle was wet, not slick with water, but damp as though touched by a hand long since buried. I recoiled. My skin remembered that moisture even after I wiped my palm dry. I could not bring myself to open the door. Instead, I backed away, slowly, not daring to turn my back until I reached the stairs again. I spent the rest of the night outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening. They never came back. Morning brought light, but not relief. The forest was blanketed in a strange mist, low and clinging. I walked the perimeter, calling again, searching for any sign of my friends. Their cars were untouched. No footprints led away from the cabin. It was as though they had been lifted bodily from the house and erased. When I returned inside, something had changed. The tapestries. They were no longer abstract. In the dawn light, the patterns had resolved into crude, primitive depictions. A group of figures gathered around a central shape, spindly limbed, faceless, towering. Above them, curling symbols, etched in dark red thread, gleamed with an oily shimmer. I do not know how I had not seen this before, or had it not been there. I remembered then something Marcus had said weeks before, a joke about the cabin being old, like pre-colonial or whatever. I'd thought nothing of it, but now the place felt older than that, older than anything I knew. It felt not built, but birthed, something grown from the ground and hollowed out for use, something that had always been waiting. I tried to leave. I packed what I could, slammed the door, and marched to my car. The engine turned, stuttered, then fell silent. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the battery, intact, the gas full. Yet the car refused to acknowledge me, as though it too had decided to stay. In frustration, I slammed the door, and in that moment I heard laughter, faint, echoing. Not from the forest, but from within the cabin itself. It was not joyous. It was hollow, strained, like wind whistling through ribs. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to bring me to my knees. I do not remember the rest of that day clearly. Time became formless. I wandered the house, touched things compulsively. The cups on the table had rearranged themselves. The deck of cards now showed only the same face, an inverted figure with elongated limbs and blank eyes. The cigars were burned to the nub, though I had not seen them lit. By evening, the candles would no longer light. I tried with a lighter, with matches. The wicks hissed, refused. The only light was the fire, which now crackled of its own accord, though I had never lit it. Its flames cast shadows that moved against their source, bending away from the walls like dancers in reverse. That night I dreamed, or believed I did. I stood in the clearing, the cabin behind me silent and dark. The trees circled inward, their trunks forming a kind of corridor. From the forest came figures, tall, thin, cloaked in moss and soil, their movements jittery and incomplete, like frames missing in old film. They encircled me. In the center something rose. It was not a person, not even a creature. It was a shape that defied description, an arrangement of limbs and roots, of bone and glistening dark matter, its presence ancient and awful. It leaned close and I felt my mind buckle, not from fear, but from recognition. I had seen this thing before, not here, not in this life, but somewhere beneath it, a memory older than my body. I awoke screaming. My throat was hoarse, my hands bled. I had scratched at my arms in the night, though I did not recall it. The tapestries were gone. Only bare wood remained. Yet when I stepped back outside, I saw them fluttering in the trees, as though the forest had claimed them. I stayed in the cabin another night. I do not know why. Maybe part of me knew there was no leaving, or perhaps I had already become part of it. On the third day, the front door opened on its own. Sunlight streamed in, strong and clear for the first time since I'd arrived. Birds chirped, absurd in their normalcy. My car engine roared to life without protest. I loaded my things in silence and left without once looking back. The trees seemed thinner on the way out, the road more defined, as though whatever had once clouded it had retracted, satisfied. I told no one what happened. I claimed the others had vanished during a hiking trip, a tragedy. Authorities found no evidence of foul play, no blood, no trace. Their families grieved. The world moved on. But I haven't. Something followed me back. I feel it even now. In mirrors, reflections move a fraction behind me. In dreams, I return to that clearing, only now the figures have names. My friends. I see their faces twisted into something inhuman, yet pleading. And always, always, I hear that laughter, soft and hollow. I am to be married next week. Invitations have been sent. The venue is remote, a mountainside chapel chosen by my fiancé's family. Last night, I dreamed of a tapestry. It hung above the altar, red and gold, depicting a celebration, but the faces were blank. The central figure stood tall and vast, crowned with antlers and shrouded in fog. It watched, and I understood. This was never about me, not me as a man, not me as a groom, but me as an offering. Some traditions are older than love and far harder to break. I first saw the village of Ashford in a dream, or perhaps it was something deeper, something older. It greeted me with silence, a silence so complete it felt like a damp cloth pressed against my skin, soaking into me. I wasn't meant to be there, but I went anyway. The journey began on a gray November day, beneath a sky the color of dying embers. I had been driving aimlessly, trying to escape the din of my own life. Past the last service station and miles beyond any cell signal, I spotted a weathered sign. Ashford, Eastern 1694. The wood was rotten, but the name remained etched into it like a wound that never healed. I turned without thinking, as if something inside me responded to a frequency my ears couldn't detect. The road narrowed almost immediately, its edges broken by skeletal trees that scraped the sky. Their branches twisted overhead, casting shade over the daylight. My tires whispered over gravel, the sound fragile, like footsteps on frost. As I descended into the hollow where the town lay, the air changed. It felt heavier, colder, charged with anticipation, like the atmosphere before a storm or a ritual. Ashford appeared suddenly, as if peeled into reality from some hidden seam in the earth. The buildings were timber-framed and sagging, coated with the gray dust of time. No power lines, no cars, no signs of the present. It looked untouched by anything but weather and memory. Yet I saw no one. I parked on what seemed to be the main street, a winding path of cobblestones now half consumed by moss. The village felt half-formed, like something recalled from a fevered mind, rather than built with human hands. I stepped out into the stillness, and it wrapped around me like a veil. I could sense things, not voices or creatures, but something subtler. The rustle of distant reeds where there was no wind, the low creak of ancient beams, the suggestion of movement beneath the ground. It wasn't sound so much as sensation, a tickling at the base of my skull, a rhythm older than words. Each structure I passed seemed to watch me. Windows gaped like open mouths. The wood of the doors bore strange symbols, half erased by time but still pulsing with quiet intent. They resembled constellations or scars. I don't know why I entered the house at the center of town. There was no invitation, no compulsion, only a soft alignment between the door and my hand, as if both had waited years to meet. Inside, it smelled of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. Dust lay thick on every surface, but there were no cobwebs, no signs of animals. The floorboards murmured beneath my steps. I wandered through empty rooms, each more peculiar than the last. One contained only a rusted cradle, the floor beneath it worn to a hollow. Another, a wall covered in dozens of small handprints, pressed into the plaster like fossils. Some were fresh, some impossibly small. It was in the attic where I found the journal. Bound in leather so dry it cracked beneath my touch, the pages were warped, ink faded to sepia veins. The entries were undated but feverish, written in a trembling hand. Most were unintelligible, frantic spirals of repeated words, symbols, drawings of concentric circles enclosing an eye that bled into the margins. But one passage remained clear. We buried them upright so they would listen. The ash does not sleep. It waits. Blood remembers. Ashford remains. I closed the journal and felt the temperature drop, not from the wind or failing insulation, but from within the house itself, as if its walls exhaled cold, slow, and deliberate. A pressure filled my chest, thick as smoke. My vision blurred at the edges, and a sound, no, a pulse began beneath my feet. When I stepped outside, dusk had arrived too quickly. The sun hung low, pale and sickly, casting long shadows that bent oddly, as if reluctant to fall in line. That's when I noticed it. Smoke, curling from the chimney of a distant cottage at the edge of town. A thrill of fear rose within me, irrational, immediate. The village had seemed dead, abandoned, but now it breathed. I walked toward the house, driven more by instinct than choice. The air felt thicker there, filled with the scent of burning herbs and something pungent, like animal fat. The door was slightly ajar, the warm flicker of firelight leaking through the crack. Yet when I pushed it open, I found nothing. No fire, no furniture. Just a single, enormous hole in the center of the floor, as wide as the room itself. A pit carved into the earth, lined with stone, descending into a darkness that refused the light of my phone's flashlight. The smell was worse here, rot and rust, and something sweet. I backed away. My breath came short, my vision swimming again. That night I slept in my car with the doors locked, though no part of me believed they would keep anything out. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought dreams not of the town, but beneath it, of caverns where pale limbs twisted in silence, of eyes suspended in black fluid, open and staring. I woke with blood in my mouth and a scream caught in my throat. I should have left, but I didn't. Over the next day, I explored more of Ashford. Each structure seemed frozen in the moment its occupants vanished. Plates still on tables, coats hanging by doors, but no bodies, no signs of decay, only absence and the pervasive whisper of something just beyond comprehension. In one home, the walls were covered in charcoal drawings, spirals, eyes, stars. In another, a chair had been nailed to the ceiling. I found an old church, its pews reduced to splinters, the altar covered in black mold. A hole had been dug behind it, narrow, like a grave meant for a child, or something smaller. That evening, I wandered the woods beyond the village, drawn by the soft sound of bells. They rang intermittently, their tones strange, thin, distant, like glass tapping underwater. The forest floor was soft and the trees twisted unnaturally, as if they had been shaped by hands rather than grown. I found more of the symbols, carved into bark, shaped from bone, laid in ash. I began to feel watched, constantly. I never saw anything, never heard footsteps, but I felt it, behind me, beside me, beneath me. Something ancient and impossibly still, waiting. On the third night, I lost time. I remember sitting in my car, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. It reflected nothing but the street behind me, veiled in fog. I blinked, and the world skipped. I was no longer in the car, but standing in the village square, surrounded by a circle of stones I hadn't seen before. My clothes were damp, my hands stained with dirt. The moon overhead pulsed, slow and heavy, casting shadows that danced of their own volition. I heard a voice then, not with my ears but within me. Not words either, but a sensation. Recognition, ownership, blood remembers. I fell to my knees, overtaken by a vision of generations buried here not in death, but in sleep, of rituals that stretched back before the founding of the village, of a seed planted in the soil of Ashford, fed with silence, nurtured with fear, of a hunger beneath the earth, bound not with chains, but with memory. I tried to leave the next morning. My car wouldn't start. My phone displayed only a black screen. The road I came in on was gone, or rather, it now ended in a sheer wall of trees, as if the forest had sealed itself shut. I began walking. Hours passed. The woods did not end. Eventually, I returned to Ashford. There was no other choice. Now, I sleep in the attic of the house with the journal. The pages have changed. New entries appear nightly in my handwriting, though I don't recall writing them. Some are in languages I don't know. Others are only drawings, of spirals, of eyes, of shapes that hurt to look at. My dreams bleed into waking. I hear voices in the soil. The house speaks in creaks and sighs. The village watches. And I too begin to forget the world beyond its borders. I have come to understand that Ashford is not a place, but a receptacle, a crucible for memory, a boundary between the known and the before. It gathers those who wander. It waits for the ones who belong. I don't know how long I have been here. I don't know if I ever truly arrived, but I know this. The pit beneath the cottage grows deeper. I hear it breathing now, and sometimes I see shapes rise from it, slender, silent, draped in ash. They do not speak. They listen. And beneath the bones of Ashford, something ancient stirs in time with my heartbeat. Something that remembers me. Something that waited. It began with a sound no louder than a whisper, something like wind gliding across a piano string barely there, yet insistent enough to pull me from sleep. I lay still, eyes closed, heart steady, but it returned again, closer, clearer, as if the house itself had learned how to exhale. I hadn't been to my grandparents' estate in nearly 15 years. After their deaths, the property passed to my father, who left it untouched, suspended in time like a forgotten relic behind a glass case. Only now, after his own quiet passing, had it come into my care. I wasn't ready for inheritance, nor did I particularly want it, but something pulled me there all the same. A sense of duty, perhaps, or guilt, or something more ambiguous, less nameable. The house stood 3 stories tall, steep-roofed and iron-spined, its white paint now dulled by years of wind and ash-gray mold. Built in the early 1900s, it had been known in the town as the Generation House, not merely for its age, but because each floor had once housed a different branch of our family. A vertical bloodline, stacked like pages in a forgotten book. When I first stepped inside, I was struck by the stillness. Not the silence one expects in an old, empty home, but a denser, more oppressive quiet, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The scent was unmistakable: aged wood, trapped heat, and the faint mineral tang of time-worn brass. Dust clung to every surface like it feared being swept away. Wallpaper peeled like old skin, revealing patterns that seemed to shift if I stared too long. I moved through the halls deliberately, running my fingers across the ridged wood of the banisters, trying to find something familiar in the decay. My memories were soft-edged. Holiday dinners, the sound of piano keys struck at random by childish hands, my grandmother's perfume lingering on her shawls. But they unraveled quickly, replaced by a peculiar tension I couldn't explain, a discomfort that clung to the soles of my shoes like damp soil. I chose the second-floor bedroom to sleep in, my father's old room, I believe, though the bed's mattress had grown lumpy and sour with age. The window overlooked the back field, where wheat once grew but now stood barren, an expanse of pale stalks, broken and tangled like brittle bones. That first night I dreamed of keys, a jangling bundle of them clutched tight in my fist, their teeth sharp and unfamiliar. I awoke before dawn, heart racing, hand clenched. The sound returned each night, soft and musical, like breath dragged across a metal comb. Sometimes it echoed from the attic above, sometimes from beneath the floorboards. It wasn't loud enough to frighten, but that was its strength. It wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to lure me. On the 4th night, I followed it. The stairs to the 3rd floor were narrower, steeper, as if the architecture itself had grown hostile toward ascension. The banister ended prematurely, swallowed by shadow. The floorboards creaked beneath me, not from my weight, but independently, like they remembered other footsteps. The corridor beyond was lined with oil portraits of ancestors I didn't recognize, their features solemn and faintly smeared, as if water had once run across their faces and been hastily dried. The smell up there was different, less musty, more pungent, tinged with something sweetly rancid like spoiled fruit or rotting flowers. There were 7 doors on the top floor, all closed, all without keyholes. I stood there for a long time, unsure of which was the source of the noise, unsure whether any of them had ever truly been opened. I didn't touch the doorknobs. I simply stared, heart pounding, until something in me recoiled, an instinct older than memory, and I fled back downstairs. After that, the dreams changed. No longer abstract, they took on a spatial logic, a shifting house with infinite staircases that turned back on themselves, with doors that led to rootless basements and endless night fields. There were rooms that whispered, that bled dust, that pulsed with warmth like living organs. I dreamed of a dining room where portraits blinked, of a nursery lined with teeth instead of toys, of a mirror that didn't reflect me but something patient and still and waiting. I began to sleep less, to eat erratically. I stopped answering phone calls. The house had become my entire world, and I wandered it for hours each day, cataloging its imperfections like symptoms. I found things I couldn't explain, pages of an unfamiliar language scratched into the baseboards. All the clocks stopped at 3:12 a.m., piles of broken glass behind the walls, as though the mirrors had exploded inward. The ground floor had a parlor I barely remembered, though its fireplace remained intact, filled with brittle logs and ancient ash. On the mantel sat a small metal box, triangular and tarnished. I don't know why I opened it. Inside, nestled in red velvet, was a length of pale hair, coiled like a keepsake. Beneath it, a yellowed photograph, a child with no eyes, mouth open in a silent scream. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the house shift and sigh and breathe. It no longer waited for nightfall. I could hear it even in daylight now, the creak of invisible footsteps, the soft clink of metal keys in distant rooms, the occasional distant scraping like wood dragged across stone. One morning I noticed something else. My reflection was wrong. Not grotesquely, not obviously, but there were moments, brief and sharp, when I turned my head and my reflection didn't, or when my eyes blinked slightly out of sync. Once I saw something standing behind me in the glass, though no one was there when I turned. I stopped using mirrors after that. The isolation deepened. Time became unreliable, with whole afternoons lost or repeated. I would find myself in unfamiliar rooms with no memory of entering them. I once awoke in the attic, curled beside a sealed trunk whose lock had rusted into nothing. I dared not open it. I tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. My phone had long since died. I wrote letters, but they remained piled at the door, unread and slowly yellowing. The landline only produced static, though once, buried beneath the hiss, I thought I heard someone breathing. The days grew longer, or perhaps I simply stopped marking them. The house aged with me, or I with it. I came to believe it was not haunted in the conventional sense. It was not a place where spirits lingered. It was the spirit, a presence far older than my grandparents, than the structure itself. Something that had dwelled on this land before names, before language. Something remembered by the trees outside, their bark knotted with patterns too regular to be natural. Something preserved in the dirt cellar, where bones had once been burned for warmth or worship. The house was a conduit, a vessel, a skin worn over something cosmic and cruel and curious. It fed on attention, on memory, on lineage. It had watched generations rise and rot within its walls. It didn't want me, not in the way a predator wants prey. It wanted me to become, to be its next storyteller, its new nerve ending. I began to see them in the walls, my family, not as ghosts but as impressions, shadowy outlines pressed into the wood like fossils. They watched without eyes, moved without sound. When I closed my own eyes, I saw through theirs. Vast spirals of black light, burning altars of bones, an endless spiral staircase descending into a womb of smoke and stone. I tried one last time to open the 7 doors on the top floor. This time, they opened. Behind each was not a room, but a void. A negative space utterly black, swallowing sound and warmth and light. I stepped through the first, then the second. Each time I returned to the hallway unchanged, but I knew I had gone somewhere. The air felt wrong inside me, heavier, as though I had breathed in something ancient and irreversible. After the 7th, I didn't come back. I still walk the house. At least I think I do. My hands are thin now, translucent in certain light. I no longer cast a shadow. My breath doesn't fog glass. When I touch the walls, they hum beneath my skin, as though recognizing me. I don't sleep. I don't eat. I no longer wonder how long I have been here. Outside, the field has begun to grow again. Not wheat, but something stranger. Thin silver stalks that glisten in moonlight and hum when the wind passes through them. The trees sway against a sky I no longer trust. Stars forming patterns I have never seen before. Sometimes, I think I hear my name called from the floorboards. Sometimes I answer. I understand now what the house is. Not a home, not a relic, but a memory. Not mine, but one that uses me to remember itself. An intelligence without shape, older than language, than blood, than breath. It dreamed of being human once, and we gave it that dream, generation by generation. It is no longer dreaming, and I am no longer awake. Some houses are too quiet to be trusted. There's a silence that feels like sleep, and then there's the kind that watches you breathe. I never believed in the soul of a place until the night I returned alone to my family's house, an old colonial structure that had stood for over a century on the edge of an autumn-stripped forest in upstate New York. I had grown up there, left it behind in my 20s, and forgotten the peculiar weight of its presence until I stepped inside again, 27 years old and freshly orphaned. My parents' deaths had been mundane. A car accident on a slick road, a lost curve, the indifferent crunch of metal. Grief moves through the body like a fog, slow and clinging, and I found myself drifting back to the house for reasons that, even now, feel more like a summons than a choice. The funeral was over. The family scattered. No one wanted the house. But something in me did. It was mid-November. The trees had been stripped to their bones, and the air smelled faintly of rust and wet leaves. The house welcomed me with the same uneasy warmth I remembered from childhood, the kind that feels borrowed rather than generated, as though the heat came not from the furnace but from something living between the walls. I turned the key, stepped inside, and for a long moment felt as if the house exhaled. Dust motes spiraled through the dim light from the foyer chandelier. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots in places I didn't step. The radiators hissed, but the air felt untouched, cold, as if the house had held its breath since my last departure. I told myself it was just age, that old houses shift and settle like tired bodies. I told myself many things in the first few hours, that the scratching behind the walls was mice, that the smell in the attic was mildew, that the way the mirrors seemed to shimmer at the edges was merely the distortion of old glass. I made up a bed in my childhood room. The furniture was still there, my narrow wooden desk, the twin bed with the iron frame, the bookshelf lined with yellowing paperbacks. The window faced the woods. The moonlight sifted through the branches like fingers searching for something they'd lost. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. There's a certain hum in the background of modern life. Electricity, traffic, the sigh of vents. But this house rejected such noise. Even the refrigerator in the kitchen refused to click or drone. I lay awake for hours, straining against the silence, my ears inventing sounds from the darkness, faint taps, dry whispers like breath slipping beneath the door. I thought it was grief making me paranoid. I thought it would pass. But the house had been waiting for me, and it did not want to be forgotten. On the second day, I found something in the basement. Not a discovery, exactly, but a recollection. A hatch I had never noticed before, hidden behind a shelving unit stacked with canned tomatoes and dust-choked paint cans. The wood was stained dark, the handle rusted. It opened with the groan of something long disused. Beneath it lay a narrow stairwell carved directly into the foundation, stone steps worn by time and water. No light, no railing, just descent. I did not go down that day, or the next, but I dreamed of it. Dreams that came in fragments, dark hallways twisting upon themselves, voices speaking in reverse. My parents standing in the doorway of my room without eyes, their mouths slightly open as though straining to say something I couldn't hear. On the fourth night, the house began to shift. It started with the mirrors. I would glance at them and see myself a fraction out of sync, my hands rising a beat too late, my head tilting slightly farther than I remembered. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. Then came the lights. Each evening I would find a different lamp turned on, always in rooms I hadn't entered. The living room, the upstairs bathroom. Once, even the attic, though I had locked it after finding the old photo albums warped and stuck together. The images inside faded to gray. The light bulbs flickered at odd intervals. I replaced them. Still the glow pulsed. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but rhythmic, like a heartbeat felt through the soles of one's feet. I stopped sleeping. Instead, I listened to the tapping behind the walls that grew louder with each passing night, to the sound of fabric being pulled across floorboards, to the creak of footsteps in the hallway outside my door, though I never heard them come or go, just the momentary wait. the slight shift of wood. There was something else, too. A scent, faint at first but steadily growing, earthy, sweet, almost cloying, like damp soil mixed with decay. I found it strongest near the basement hatch. It made my stomach twist with some ancient instinct. I tried to rationalize it, mold, animal droppings, but the smell was too deliberate, as if placed there, as if whatever lived below wanted to be noticed. I began to hear things in the static of the old radio in the den, whispered syllables, never clear, always slipping just beneath understanding. My name, I thought, or something shaped like it. On the 6th night, I awoke to find mud on the floor beside my bed, dark, thick, smelling of rot. One footprint, bare, human, pressed into the wood with such clarity that I could see the ridges of the toes. The door had remained closed. I sat in the center of the room for hours, watching the walls, trying not to blink. That morning, I opened the basement hatch. I don't know why. Perhaps it was inevitability. Or perhaps the house had grown tired of waiting. The air below was colder than I imagined. Still, heavier, as if pressure itself increased with each step downward. I carried a flashlight, but the beam felt weak against the darkness. The walls were damp stone. The steps spiraled deeper than the house should have allowed, far past the limits of its foundation, into a space that smelled older than time. The smell was thick now, not just rot, but iron and mildew and something else. Something wet and hungry. At the bottom, the stairway opened into a chamber. I struggled to describe it, not because I couldn't recall, but because memory recoils from it. It was not merely a room, but a presence. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The ceiling arched unnaturally, curving like the inside of a skull. In the center stood a stone basin, shallow and dark. Symbols carved along the edge flickered when the light hit them, twisting lines that seemed to shift as I looked at them. And above the basin, a mirror, old, cracked, suspended without support. I did not see my reflection in it. Not immediately. First, I saw movement, shapes writhing behind the glass, like shadows submerged beneath water. Then slowly, my own image emerged, but it was not me. It was what the house remembered of me. My face was thinner, my eyes sunken, my expression wrong, almost expectant. I lifted my hand. It did the same, but the timing was off, like the memory of a movement, not the thing itself. I turned and fled. The stairs stretched longer on the way up, but I kept climbing, breath ragged, throat raw. The air thickened behind me, as if something followed. I did not close the hatch. I should have, but I feared turning my back on it more than I feared what might emerge. From that moment, the house changed. It no longer pretended to be a home. The walls groaned during the day. The windows warped the light into strange patterns that lingered even when I blinked. I stopped seeing my reflection entirely. The mirrors showed other rooms, always empty, but subtly wrong. Objects misaligned, doorways leading to places that did not exist. I left the lights on, all of them, but the shadows grew deeper. They began to move of their own accord, slipping along the floor like stains spreading from unseen wounds. And the dreams became sermons. I would wake with phrases still echoing in my ears, fragments in an unknown language, syllables that tasted like metal and ash. I began writing them down, without knowing why. Pages filled with looping symbols I did not recognize. The final night came without warning. No thunder, no crescendo, only stillness. I sat in the living room, surrounded by lights, radio static buzzing like flies, and then everything turned off. Silence slammed into the room like a lid closing. The air shifted, heavy, oily. I could feel it, something rising from below, not through stairs or doors, but through the foundation itself, seeping up through the house like moisture through rotting wood. The walls pulsed. The light outside the windows darkened, though it was only 8 in the evening, and then I heard it. Not footsteps, not voices, breathing, not mine. Deep, wet, deliberate, from inside the walls. I rose slowly. The room swam. My vision bent at the edges, as if reality itself had begun to peel, and in the center of the room stood the mirror from the basement. I don't know how it came to be there. It hovered inches from the floor, shards curling like petals from its frame. The glass was not reflective but fluid, a dark surface that rippled as if something stirred beneath it. I approached, as if compelled. Within it, I saw my reflection, but I was not alone. Behind me stood a figure, faceless, thin, draped in what looked like wet fabric, its surface crawling with veins. Its arms were too long, its fingers too still. I turned. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror. It was closer. Not the image. The thing. I stepped back. The glass cracked. I ran. I don't remember leaving the house. I only remember the cold, the air on my face, the mud beneath my feet. I ran until my lungs burned and the trees gave way to road. That was 5 months ago. I did not tell anyone. What would I say? I rented an apartment far from woods, far from silence. I leave the lights on. I removed all mirrors. But the reflections find other ways. The puddle in the bathroom sink. The black of my phone screen when it turns off. Sometimes I see it. Sometimes I see me looking back, but not quite right. The house is still there. I check sometimes. It's still listed under my name. No one has bought it. But sometimes late at night I receive calls from the landline we never disconnected. The line is always silent, except for the breathing. I was never supposed to take that road. Even now, years later, I wake at 3:13 a.m. sharp, every night, soaked in sweat, the taste of rust in my mouth, as if the highway still clings to me like a second skin. It began in late October, when the air feels dry and sour with the scent of distant burning leaves, and the dusk seems to drag its feet a little too long. I had been driving cross-country from Maryland to Arizona, something about a new start. Although I now forget where I was going or why I left in the first place. What I do remember is that I had grown tired, not just of the drive, but of the repetition, the scenery that never truly changed. Even the gas stations and their humming fluorescence felt copied and pasted, populated by the same dead-eyed travelers hunched over vending machines. Around 11 p.m., somewhere past Oklahoma, I saw the sign. Faded green, cracked at the edges, barely lit by my headlights. It read simply, Route 77A, Old County Highway local traffic. Only I shouldn't have taken it. But something about the number felt familiar, like a forgotten street from childhood or a dream I'd had many times before but couldn't name. Maybe I was searching for something deeper than just a shortcut. Maybe I was chasing silence. So I turned. The road was narrow and wound like a ribbon unraveling across the empty plains. Black asphalt swallowed my tires whole, and the lines in the center had long since faded. A few minutes in, the temperature inside the car dropped. Not by much, but enough to make my breath fog the windshield faintly. I thought the AC had kicked on, but it hadn't. I remember touching the vents. They were silent. Still, I rolled down the window for air, but what came in was not wind. It was stillness, a kind of silence so complete that it felt like pressure in my ears, like being submerged. I heard no insects, no distant hum of life, only the low, grinding rhythm of my tires passing over coarse road, and yet I kept driving. As I went deeper, something subtle began to shift. The trees lining the roadside became taller, gnarled, twisted in ways that felt unnatural. Their bark glistened in the moonlight as if wet, and their branches reached not toward the sky but toward the road, like claws stretching to snag passing prey. Some were dead entirely, black husks, their surfaces blistered and charred, as though struck by lightning that left no scorch marks on the ground. And the sky above. The stars were wrong. I couldn't articulate it at first, but after half an hour of driving, I noticed that familiar constellations were absent. Orion wasn't there. The Big Dipper, gone. In their place were strange, shifting arrangements of faint points that pulsed ever so slightly like eyes slowly adjusting to the dark. I pulled over. I remember the texture of the steering wheel beneath my fingertips, cold, rough, slightly damp. As I turned the key to cut the engine, a sound met me, so faint at first I thought it was imagined. A low humming, like breath on glass. It grew louder the longer I sat, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not mechanical, not natural. It sounded like chanting, though not in any language I knew. Not words, just syllables, stretched and buried beneath layers of echo and static. I stepped out of the car. The ground felt soft beneath my boots like moss or thick velvet. It absorbed sound. The crunch of gravel was absent. Even my footsteps felt weightless. The air smelled wrong, like old milk and copper, mixed with something floral and rotting. I tried to orient myself, but the horizon had vanished. There was no end to the trees. No moon now. Only a deep violet haze above, pulsing in time with that unplaceable sound. Then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing motionless on either side of the road, half shrouded in the shadows of the trees. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. I could not make out their faces, only their outlines, tall, thin, impossibly still. The longer I stared, the more I realized they were not facing me, but facing each other, across the road, as if I had interrupted something ancient. I got back into the car. I locked the doors, an instinctual act, meaningless in the face of whatever this was. The figures did not approach. They didn't flinch. I turned the key. The car groaned once and died. I tried again. A soft click, then nothing. The chanting grew louder. There was no source. It was not in my ears, but in my bones. I could feel it resonating beneath my skin, a low tremor that rattled the back of my skull and filled my mouth with a phantom taste, clay, soil, and something older. I slammed my hands against the dashboard, breathing hard, and that's when I saw the mirror. The rear view, it had turned black, not dim, not shadowed, black. A void where reflection should have been. I reached up, touched it. The glass rippled beneath my fingers like water. My skin tingled, then burned, and I yanked my hand away, a fine dust of ash falling from my palm. I blinked. The road behind me was gone. Not just dark, absent. Where there had once been a narrow trail of asphalt now stood an unbroken wall of trees, thick and woven together like bone. There was no going back. Panic became a dull, molten thing in my chest. I stopped thinking logically. I stepped out again, half collapsing against the hood. The air was warmer now, too warm, like the breath of something vast. The sky had shifted. Again. The stars now spun slowly in a spiral, all of them orbiting a single black point in the center of the sky. That central void pulsed once, and I heard, felt, something like a heartbeat echo in the dirt beneath my feet. I walked. There was nothing else to do. I left the car behind, drawn forward by something I could not name. The figures remained on either side of the road, unmoving, unblinking. They seemed taller now, and I couldn't be sure, but some of them looked more defined, as if they were slowly gaining shape, detail, features. The trees closed in. The road narrowed. The chanting grew into a chorus. Then I reached the bridge. It rose out of the darkness like a rib cage, its metal twisted and rusted, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Crude, jagged spirals and sharp lines like scratches made in desperation. Beneath it there was no river, only a black fog that churned in slow circles, reaching up like fingers grasping at the steel supports. I should have turned back. I crossed. The moment I stepped onto the bridge, my body felt heavy, as if gravity itself had doubled. My thoughts blurred, my memories twisted. I tried to recall my childhood home and saw only shapes, a hallway that never ended, a door that pulsed like a heartbeat. I tried to remember my own face and couldn't. I was unraveling, and still, I walked. Halfway across, I noticed something ahead, a figure, not like the others. This one was clearer, human in form, tall, draped in cloth that moved without wind. It faced away from me, yet I could feel its gaze like a weight on my spine. It was waiting. I stopped walking. I did not want to reach it, but my legs kept moving. My feet obeyed a rhythm not my own. One step, another. And then I was close enough to see the texture of its robes, stitched from something that looked like hair and sinew. It raised one arm, a gesture, not a threat, but an invitation. I took another step. The bridge collapsed. I didn't fall. The world around me simply changed. No sky, no ground, no direction. Only a vast chamber of endless stone, walls lined with shelves upon shelves of jars, each one filled with a single tooth. Some human, others not. I heard a distant hum, and from the center of the chamber rose a shape, enormous, unfathomable. Not beast, not God, not even a concept I could describe, just mass, rhythm, presence. I understood then that I had not driven off course. I had been chosen, not for punishment, not for salvation, but for preservation. A voice, not sound, but thought, entered me. You will remember what others forget. You will carry the road. And then I was back, in my car, on the highway. Morning sun cutting through my windshield, my hands on the wheel, white-knuckled and shaking. I was back, but not whole. The mirror reflected nothing. The radio no longer worked. The fuel gauge stayed frozen. And the chanting never stopped. I tried telling people. No one believes me. They smile politely, then grow distant. Relationships fade. Time slips strangely. Days feel like hours. Nights stretch long and cold. Sometimes at 3:13 a.m. I feel the road pull at me again. Sometimes I wake up already driving. And always, the black ribbon waits.